Welcome, Delian. It is so good to have you on today. First and foremost, how is life treating you in Miami?
Not too shabby. Like we were just saying, I like being in a town filled with people that hate communism. Feels like I'm back in Bulgaria.
Speaking in Bulgaria, I know you know that a big part of what I love to do is help people who are of the immigrant or first gen descent. And being somebody that moved here early on from an Eastern European country, it has had a huge impact on your identity. Can you kind of share what it's done for you and kind of what your parents afforded you early on?
Yeah, I mean, we moved to the United States when I was, 4 years old from Bulgaria. Like literally my first like memory as a child is actually like when we like arrived in the United States because it was just like jarring and in some ways like shocking moment for a kid. But there's a couple of different things that I've learned from my parents' experience. During their time in the United States, right? We moved to for my dad to go to grad school at Caltech with my mom joining him sort of shortly thereafter with on the order of $300 or $400 in our pocket. My parents would grind on two or three sort of jobs outside of their PhD. Actually, the way that like my mom got into the type of research that she does now, which is like experimental economics, where she actually, rather than just like observing the macroeconomic environment, creates sort of miniature trading experiments and has people actually trade back and forth and affects market conditions and sees how they react. The reason that she even got into that research was because my dad had saw a flyer for experimental economic experiment on Caltech's campus, run by my future mom's PhD advisor, where it's like you basically get paid $100 if you show up for a night and do a bunch of trading. But then, by the way, if you trade well, you actually get to keep your profits. That way, like you're incentivized to actually be good at trading. And of course, my dad, being a very good mathematician, statistician, goes into the class and is like, furiously scribbling down, okay, like this thing's going up. Here's this alpha. Here's this option. Okay, this stock pays out at this amount. And then we just like game the markets and then made a bunch of money basically trading really well via these experiments. And then my mom started joining them and they were just like trading nonstop. And that's actually what sort of got them originally interested, into economics. And so sort of finding these just like, I don't know, side hustle jobs when you basically are coming from nothing to like, find your way up. And I definitely like, I grew up poor. Like, I grew up in a family that, yeah, had very little money. We lived in like a shitty little apartment in like downtown LA. Like, I joke like I was the, for whatever preschool through like third grade, I was like the only light skinned kid in my class. Like I, definitely, grew up in a like colorful part of Los Angeles. But it was amazing to get to like watch my parents go from, having a couple $100 in their bank account to, over the course of my childhood. By the time I was like graduating high school, we had like moved to Utah. My dad had gotten a full-time job that paid quite well. My mom became a professor at the University of Utah. We like bought our first house, in Utah when we like moved there. It was just, to me, it was like astoundingly large. Like I remember our first night, we just like did not have, I mean, we were, poor grad students before that. We had like no money for real amounts of furniture. And so I remember my like first night in our Utah home, like we like slept in a sleeping bag because we were like, okay, we got to like wake up the next morning because we like just moved here. We got to like go spend mom's like signing bonus on like actually buying furniture for this place and like, figuring it out. And then there's just like this, just, it was so grilled into me that like one, successes of your own making, right? Like, my parents had plenty of friends from Bulgaria that, were stuck there, or maybe they moved to the United States and didn't have nearly as much success, but my parents had more success because they just, worked their ass off. And two, they just, printed that upon me. Like, my dad was, doing sort of, multiplication table flashcards with me before I could even like, fully speak English. Like I knew my whole times table in English before I honestly knew most of the rest of the English alphabet. When I was in, kindergarten through whatever 10th, 11th, grade in high school, I would, yeah, go to 8 hours of whatever school a day. And there was additional 4 or 5 hours at home immediately afterwards. It was just like, deep amounts of like, math competitions, robotics projects, physics classes. There was always, right? Like during the summers, I would get shipped off to Bulgaria every single year as a kid. And then, while I was there, I was constantly being tutored in math and Bulgarian history. The like summer between my like seventh and eighth grade, my dad reached back out to the Bulgarian national math team coach because he'd been on the national math team when he was in high school, and basically convinced him to have me be a part of their like basically national math team summer camp that they do every year. And so like as a whatever, I'm like 12 or 13 at the time. I'm like one living entirely alone in Bulgaria. Like they dropped me off for like 3 months and like I have to figure out my way around like, the country. Two, I'm going to these like, these like the people in this camp are like all mostly in high school and way better than me at math, right? As like a, whatever, seventh/eighth grader trying to figure things out. And then I also, did the like, whatever national computer science teams like summer camp as well. And so just got like constantly inundated with just like academics, learning, pushing yourself was like always a priority, right? The only way to succeed in life is to just work harder than everybody else. And the best way to do so is just be working all the time. And so that sort of work ethic got instilled for me sort of, from day one, but also sort of like sense of independence as well, where it's just like those summers in Bulgaria were always so fun. Cause like, for sure my parents would flit in and out, but they also had their own things that they were, working on during those summers. And so I just like learned how to, I don't know, take care of myself and live. And, hell, I was like clubbing when I was like 13, 14 and was like, out on the Bulgarian beaches and then waking up for like, math competitions like the next day. Whereas I feel like most of my peers, that like stayed in the United States were just like, had their like American helicopter parents. And so, a lot of my like in some ways like most formative like memories as a child, like yes I did like schooling in the United States, but those like summers in Bulgaria where I felt like I learned a lot of my like early social lessons, independence, how to work really hard, were actually all in Bulgaria. And so I feel like I remember actually when I finally like I unfortunately couldn't visit after that summer because I basically just started having American like internships that I would do every summer after that, or like things that I went to like a math camp in Texas one summer, et cetera. And so I didn't get to go back actually until like the equivalent of like the summer after my senior year of college, even though I did drop out, but like that was the first time that I got to go back since, that seventh and eighth grade summer. And I remember having this like massive like aha moment where like after spending, my cousin is my same age in Bulgaria and like spending a couple of weeks with him in Bulgaria, I had this sudden realization where I was like, oh, all these things that like were, I thought super unique and weird and made me feel like I didn't fit into like America very well and thought like something was just like off in my brain. It was like, no, those aren't particularly unique. Those things are all just Bulgarian. Like you grew up in Bulgaria and all your like social norms were Bulgarian. And some of those just did not jive when you like went to America and went to American high school and like, American college. Hell, even considering myself an American honestly only happened like maybe freshman or sophomore year of college. And so like for the longest time, I was like, oh no, I'm just Bulgarian that happens to be like temporarily in America, but who knows? But I think it was actually through discovering the technology industry where I was like, oh my God, actually the like real level up is like, no, I'm not actually a Bulgarian. Like I am, but like, I'm actually a proud American immigrant. And I'm very proud that we have this country that allows anybody to succeed, basically from nothing and is so welcoming of, all high skill, immigrants. That's partially why I love Miami so much right now. Is it's the only metropolitan, area in the entire United States that is like, majority, foreign born, right? 55% of residents in Miami were not born in the United States. And so I feel so much more at home here than anywhere else that I felt in the United States, because everywhere it's just like Argentinians and Venezuelans and Cubans and, French and Spanish and, Germans, just like all over the place. I'm like, great, these are my people. Like the people that just like hustled, got their way into America and are working their ass off, or like my types of people, not the fucking like landed gentry of Silicon Valley that just like inherited, their parents' house and grew up in Palo Alto and went to some, $50,000 a year school and then went to Stanford and then now are lecturing me on like diversity. I'm like, you've grown up in like the most whitewashed, constrained environment. I don't really want to hear you, lecture me. So I feel very at home here.
So many fascinating stories in there. What I will say, I could totally empathize with you on the multiplication tables because that was probably the first thing you learn as an Eastern European immigrant, or any immigrant for that matter. But what's really important to distinguish is you're talking about two types of mindset, right? There's plenty of immigrants that don't actually succeed. They don't figure out how to actually make the transition, let alone assimilate into this American culture, right? Your parents had that hustle, the tenacity, they clearly carried it over to you personally. Given that you have a really interesting perspective into the lens of founders and other individuals in today's world, and you have this front row seat to seeing a lot of immigrants, particularly in Miami right now, what do you think is different today for people coming to America who want to succeed? So if your parents were to come to America today, is it the same thing, the same type of mindset that they need? Or is there different tools or strategies that they need to learn that will truly make them successful here?
I mean, I feel like in my parents' era, it really was like the academic institutions that were the place where you could sort of be assimilated and have a sort of like constrained environment where you could learn, grow, hustle, and, then, join sort of like, the true like American culture. I feel like at this point, it no longer feels like academia is the draw. When I hear of a lot of the like immigrants that I get most excited about, like when they're moving here, it's much less often around the academic environment. It's partially like, the academic environments in the United States, I think, have also become somewhat intellectually stifling and have various like limitations. It's not like there's zero. Obviously, there's clearly a lot of immigrants that are moving here for academics, but I feel like a lot of what I see it now is people that are maybe doing academia in their home country, but then are realizing that their home country isn't the best sort of economic setup for building their business. Right, the number of immigrants that I now know that are building their companies through seed, Series A, but then are deciding to relocate their headquarters where they're located to the United States at Series B because they're like, I want to be in the big leagues. I feel like that has really shifted. And then obviously just, American culture is a lot easier to like access and understand from afar, right? In my parents' generation, like the way that my dad learned about Caltech was like literally an encyclopedia in his university library was like how he like learned and like got the mailing address and then like mailed them to ask for application forms, right? Like seems like so archaic, but that's what it was in whatever 1994 versus now just like, having access to the internet worldwide allows people to like sort of adopt this mindset and sort of become Americans far before they actually like, move here. And then once they move here, they already can sort of assimilate more easily. So yeah, I think a lot of the just both tools, habits, patterns have changed a lot. I think the underlying like ambitions immigrants are able to and want to move to America is still very true. There's some, although speaking of, Bulgaria, there's a little bit of like a Freudian slip. I am also excited by the fact that like Bulgaria is starting to mitigate its brain drain a bit. Like if you were the top 1% of Bulgarian, mathematician, statistician, computer scientists 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, I guess, for my dad, there was no question, all of them left. Like not a single one, stayed. Versus now you're starting to actually see some of them stay. And I think that is actually exciting because I could just provide for prosperity in that region. And part of it is just like Uber has 1,000-person office in, Sofia, Adobe. There's a bunch of like, venture funded startups. UiPath, just north of us in Romania is now a $37 billion company. And so I'm both excited that these like opportunities are democratizing, but I'm also excited that America still appears to continue to be the place, maybe not as strong as it used to be, but still continues to be the place where sort of like the truly top tier companies are. Like hell, let's take UiPath as the example, right? Oh, this is amazing. I didn't even think about this as I brought it up. The UiPath CEO now lives in Miami and he like shifted all of his US operations here. And so it's like, I'm really excited that now those companies can start there, but you'll still see at the very, very top tier, people still want to move here because unlike in most other countries, we're not going to try to tax you to hell. We're not going to Jack Ma you and just like suddenly make you disappear. America allows you to succeed at a very, top tier level.
I don't think that gravitational pull is ever going to go away from the US. It might shift around as we've clearly seen over the last 12 months. But I think the theme there, as you talked about, is really adaptability, right? Your parents would have had to adapt to today's world, and people are going to have to adapt to a new world in 5, 10 years from now. I think that's also a common theme throughout your career and everything that you've done, right? I want to kind of highlight the fact that you started your career in MIT. There's something that you quickly did. And for those who might not know your story, I want you to be able to kind of highlight what happened and why you made some of those decisions early on once you got into MIT in terms of actually leaving.
Yeah, I mean, when I entered MIT, the original sort of life path was, okay, my parent, like in some ways, when I was like in high school, I thought everybody had a PhD and was like an academic basically, because like the only people that my parents hung out with were like other professors and PhDs and academics. It's like, oh, everybody gets a PhD. Like, of course, that's like what you do. That's how you succeed in life. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go to MIT. I'm going to get a PhD. I don't want to do math like my dad. I don't want to do econ like my mom. I want to do like robotics, space, something like that. I was like, I'm going to go to I'm going to do undergrad here, grad school at Caltech, and then I'm going to go to JPL. And like, that is going to be my career. And then literally like, 2 weeks in, like discovered the world of just like startups, entrepreneurship. That first freshman fall, I started going to this like entrepreneurship dinner that was hosted by the Entrepreneurship Center at MIT and like got to know a lot of the local founders, like the founder of Kayak, the founder of HubSpot. They would come and give like these like dinners and just like it opened my eyes to like, oh my God, there's this like amazing world that is like non-academia. And so I got obsessed with this idea of like, okay, man, I got to go get an internship next year. I got to go to Silicon Valley. I got to go work for one of the best entrepreneurs in the world. And at the time, in my opinion, I thought in 2000, summer 2012, Jack Dorsey was the best entrepreneur in the world. So I was like, I have to work at Square. I have to work at Square. I got to work at Square. And so I ended up getting to, join Square. I probably interviewed when it was like 100 people, joined at 120. And by the time I left at the end of my internship, we like tripled to like 300 people. Like we had 15 or I think 17 people starting a week or something like that. Like the amount of scale that the company was going through while I was there was just like absolutely insane. And then that experience was what really just made me lock in on like, I need to get out to Silicon Valley as soon as possible. And so I thankfully, luckily, happened to be roommates with a guy that was friends with a Teal fellow. And so he introduced me to this like, program. I ended up going to like one of their like summer events that summer. And then I was like, oh my God, super cool. I have to do this. And so, applied for it basically that upcoming like, sophomore winter. I basically proactively dropped out like my sophomore like spring. I only took 1.5 classes. So I was like basically dropped out already, but I was like, I'm going to focus all my time on starting to build a startup so that I could be like ready to go for like the Teal fellowship, get funding and like move back out. And then, May of 2013 was awarded the Teal fellowships and, bye-bye to MIT. My mom and dad were originally quite unhappy with this. You can imagine like them being East European, conservative PhD academic types. They were like, oh my God, what are you doing? You're throwing your whole life away. My mom had my like 4-year-old sister at the time handwrite a letter that was just like, dear Delian, like, what happens if mom and dad die in a car accident? Like, how are you going to take care of me? I'm gonna have to go into like a foster home because like, you're not gonna be able to support me because you won't be able to get a job because you don't have a degree. Like, why are you leaving school? Blah, blah, blah. It took, my dad came around more quickly. Like I remember maybe even like 6 months in, he was like, I get why you did it. Like everybody that I looked up to when I was in Bulgaria were like the, professors at the university. And so of course I was going to be there. But like when I listen to you, everybody that you look up to is in Silicon Valley. So of course, you're going to be there. My mom, honestly, I don't know, maybe she wasn't, finally, convinced until I like started my space company and was doing something, I think a little bit more technical, but, she eventually came around to it and has given up on asking me if I'm going back to MIT anytime.
I think it's definitely a good highlight into how immigrant parents operate and think. And it's naturally conservative, right? They want you to be successful. They want to protect the family, and you're going to go down that pathway. What's interesting now is that as we have more information, digital economy is booming. I think parents are starting to see the opportunities, but now you kind of have a new wave of startups, ideas that are coming that might seem foreign to the most innovative people. So there's still a transition happening. So let's fast forward. You went through that Teal Fellowship. You went through those experiences. How did you know that you wanted to ultimately go into the venture capital space?
It was like somewhat, accidental. I, originally was actually just like grabbing, dinner with Keith Rabois, one of my like sort of primary mentors from, he was the COO at Square. He had invested in my first company that I dropped out of, school to, work on. And we were grabbing dinner. And I was actually just chatting about the fact that I had a friend who had dropped out of Harvard that was actually, went back to Harvard, finished things up and was, ready to graduate and basically, come out full time to the Silicon Valley. And Keith was like, hey, I've actually been thinking about hiring a chief of staff. Maybe he would be a good candidate for it. He was like describing the job to me. And I was like, let me go pitch him on it. I call him up, I pitch him on the job. And about like halfway through pitching him, I was like, oh shit, I think I want this job because like this is a great platform to then go co-found another company by learning from Keith, getting exposure to a bunch of different potential CEOs and co-founders and things like that. As I ran back into Keith's house, kind of been doing the call outs out of it. I was like, yo, what do you think about me being the chief of staff? Screw my friend. And so Keith was like, yeah, like, talk about it. Let's do it. And like literally 2 weeks later, it basically started. And originally the goal of that was like, I was going to stay there for a year and I was going to co-found a company again. And so again, it was like, I kind of dipped my toe into venture, but the goal was to like, just dip it in for a year. And then about like, maybe 7 or 8 months in, I had a couple of like different realizations that just like really hit me like a brick. The first was I'd always really wanted to work in aerospace. And I'd had some friends from MIT that obviously gone straight to SpaceX, but that career path in life didn't seem like it was right for me. Like, yes, I think I'm a pretty solid engineer, but I feel like I'm best at sort of a breadth of activities of, engineering, storytelling, finance, marketing, management. I feel like sort of combining all those together is what I'm best at, as opposed to I felt like the SpaceX path was really pretty heavy, purely sort of like on the engineering side. Versus in month 7 at Khosla Ventures, I managed to like source an aerospace company into the firm that we ended up investing in. And I was like, whoa, I don't have to like do the SpaceX route. I don't have to do what I thought the only alternative route was, which was like the, Jurvetson, Chamath, Musk route to like make money in normal tech and then get rich. And then you get to do space stuff. It was like, whoa, I get to do space stuff like today in my like early 20s at like age, whatever, 23, I think at the time, rather than like having to wait. Like, actually, I think it closed literally right around my 24th birthday. I can do it now, not like decades from now. And so maybe I should seriously consider this. And then the other thing that really hit me like a brick was realizing that like my personality and like skill sets were just a much better fit for how a venture capitalist works than a founder works. Like I am super ADD. I'm super intellectually curious. I love like context switching between a variety of different ideas. And I really hate management and, don't really enjoy doing so, but I really do love storytelling. All of those things are generally like huge cons as a founder versus like huge pros as a VC. As a founder, you typically want to be monomaniacal. You want to really enjoy management. You have to be a very good storyteller. You have to be comfortable with like not being able to context switch and be the opposite of ADD. And I was like, man, I always tell people, and the career advice that I give is like, you should lean into your strengths rather than mitigate your weaknesses. And so I feel like I had this like, I don't know, coming to Jesus moment where up until that moment in my life, since that sort of like freshman, whatever, year at MIT, where I was like, oh, maybe I should do entrepreneurship. And I was like, okay, I have to be a CEO. That's the thing I got to do. I got to be a really killer CEO. For the first time in whatever, the 4 or 5 years since then, I was like, okay, maybe I don't need to be a CEO and actually can have a pretty successful career not being a CEO because I can lean into the things that I'm good at. And that will probably make it so that like, if I try to be a great CEO, I can probably work really, really hard and maybe I can be a top 10% CEO, but that's like trying to mitigate my weaknesses versus if I just lean into my strengths, maybe it makes it so that without even working nearly as hard, I can be a top 1% VC. I mean, if I work really, really hard, I can be a top 0.1% or 0.01% VC. And so I was like, I think it's like in some ways, both makes me happier to be in the upper echelon of performance, but then also is probably, net beneficial for society for me to just like lean into my comparative advantage and do what I'm best at. And so, yeah, kind of was like, you know what, maybe I'm going to give this venture thing a go. And so 8 months in, I was like, let me start to take this more seriously, started spending a ton more time sourcing, evaluating, diligencing, like really learning what the job of like a VC was rather than treating it as like a 1-year stint where I was going to leave and go co-found something again. And then, 4.5 years later, have my first two, let's say, sort of seed investments that turned into, unicorns, nothing liquid yet, but I think there'll be some things that, will be in the, coming couple of years. And so hopefully by, let's say, year 7, proving that I at least am pretty good at the job. And then hopefully in another 5 or 6 years after that, I can prove that I'm in the, top 0.1% of people at the job.
I think you've made plenty of splashy investments, and we can talk about that in a second. But I think what you're alluding to is this constant hustle, this hunger that you've had consistently. I think for a lot of people listening, as natural human beings, there's doubt that creeps in. There's scary moments where you start to wonder if this is possible for you. Can you share any moments throughout that period of time where you're like, oh my God, I don't know if this is right for me, or something creeped in that might have made you think this might not work out?
Oh my God, a million. Like in some ways, it's like, it's easy to like now connect the dots and like form this whole narrative that it's like, oh, it seems so natural, like Nightingale and then Teespring and then Khosla Ventures and then Founders Fund and then Varda. Like obviously that was all pre-planned. And like he's had this like life plan that is like clearly worked out exactly as he wanted. And it's like, not at all. Like Nightingale like had periods where I was like extremely depressed. I was banging my head against the wall. It was like totally flatlining. Like there were periods of time with Teespring where I was just like partying like crazy, going way too hard into like the clubbing, drinking, blah, blah. Cause I was like, screw this, screw the whole like, hustle hard mentality. Maybe I should just like, go party. I lived in LA for 6 months and like, just like totally got into like the, like, I don't know, much more vapid scene of LA, you know what I mean? Like, and I remember even just like one time, like, waking up at like this girl's house after I'd slept over and was just like, what am I doing here? Like, why am I around? Like, how did I go from like MIT to like 3 years later, I'm with all these fucking like lame LA people that like are super non-intellectual, super vapid. All they care about is appearances. You know what I mean? Like there are so many times where I like faltered or felt like I was really making wrong decisions. Even at Khosla Ventures, like it wasn't always clear to me that I was like, maybe I'm making a bad call here. Maybe I should just go back and be a founder again. Hell, even switching from Khosla Ventures to Founders Fund, I still had that doubt of like, should I really be doing venture in the long term? And I was like, okay, the one other thing that I would ever do would be like working at one of the portfolio companies that I really, really admire. And that was, Fair at the time. So I was like, I don't have any idea that I want to do. And so hell, I kind of did a, mini interview process. I kind of quickly realized, it's one of those things where I was like, actually, I do validate going through that interview. I was like, I don't want to be an operator again. Like, I don't want to be a VP at a company or something like that. Like I do actually enjoy the investing job. And then hell, even with Varda, like there was, definitely a time in like, I don't know, maybe mid-September or October of last year where I was kind of getting cold feet on it, where I was like, oh my God, like this idea is just like too ambitious. It's too crazy. Like, this is just like a too difficult a problem to be biting off. And like, I kind of had to like, these weren't like co-founders that I'd known for a decade. We kind of like, in some ways we needed such unique and disparate skill sets on the team that there was no way that like we were ever going to have been friends previously to this. Like I had to go hunt them down. I was like, I'm like betting my career and a lot of money and a lot of my reputation in venture to convince people that we should like fund this thing. And like, do I actually like know them well enough? Do I feel confident in this idea? but I don't know. I think a lot of those moments is just like you go get advice from friends, or you just kind of grit your teeth and hope that like, things will sort of get better and work out in the long term. And I tend to think like, I forget whose it is. I think it's like LeBron James was like, trust the process in some ways of like, obviously, he's, many orders of magnitude more successful than me, and maybe it sounds silly to like use his like athleticism quote in the world of venture, but I feel like that was part of it that like kind of kept me through those like darker moments, which is like if I just keep working 10, 12, 14-hour days, I keep just like pushing myself as hard as I can, eventually like something will land. You keep taking enough good bets, you get smarter at the bets that you are taking, something will start to land. And so obviously still very much in the early days of my career, Varda still has a long ways to go to being successful, but at least happy that I'm taking, a swing that, I sometimes joke. It's as far, when you put your neck on the line, well, I stretched my neck as far as one possibly could with Varda. Like that is the furthest that I could stretch my neck out on the line in terms of like, convincing VCs to basically, invest $9 million into like effectively what was just like a PDF of an idea. And I continue to only stretch my neck even further with Varda, and, hopefully one day, it'll pan out.
Yeah, I think we'll have to do V2 and V3 of this podcast years from now to revisit the success. But you're totally right. The trusted process part is super, super important. A lot of time, most people just give up because consistency is boring, right? They keep going through a process and they realize, I don't want to do this anymore, and they move on to something else. So for you to stay consistent, it's pretty impressive in what you've been able to accomplish. If you're looking at somebody today and they're interested in the VC kind of maybe even private equity world, what's your advice to them to really start pursuing that pathway? Because most VCs are pretty tight, small, and they're not the most accessible to most people. But what's your recommendation to get started?
Yeah, and I think it actually does come back down to that, like trust the process. Like getting into venture requires a very, very long-term mentality. It's not something that you can like just grind towards for like 3 to 6 months and all of a sudden like, make work just by saying the right words or hustling your way in. Like you actually have to build deep institutional trust with people that think that you actually have the operating experience and the knowledge to actually know how to both identify great investments, but then most importantly, like actually help them, sort of become, successful. And so, I think the best way to sort of get into venture capital is to gain the trust of a pre-existing venture capitalist. And the best way to do so is by working at one of their portfolio companies that is their highest potential one, and really showing that you have a significant impact there, right? If you look at some of the best investors of all time, they've all taken this path, right? Alfred Lin was the CFO and COO of Zappos. Michael Moritz was on the board of Zappos. When he was considering leaving Zappos after the sale to Amazon, Michael Moritz recruited him to Sequoia, and it was that extremely deep trust relationship because Michael Moritz had watched Alfred Lin operate for years and years on end quite successfully, and he'd been investing on the side. Keith Rabois had been investing since 2000, had clearly shown a capability of like choosing great founders and backing them, but he was a COO of Square while Vinod Khosla was on the board and got recruited into Khosla Ventures. Mine is obviously a much smaller, baby version of that story, right? But like the way that I really got to know Keith, yes, he was, an angel investor in my company. Yes, we had, gotten to know each other as like personal friends, but the thing that really formed that really close professional relationship was while I was the VP of growth at Teespring, he was on the board. And so on a very regular basis, was reporting into him as an executive, and actually got to understand how we work together at a high level, strategic, professional relationship, as opposed to something, just like an, angel investment. And so I wasn't intentionally going down that path to get into venture, but I do think that sort of relationship and time at Teespring is what really led to it. And so I typically encourage people, like the best way to sort of get into venture is like go study the portfolios of the venture investors that you really, really admire. Go find that like Series A that they just announced that you have the right skill set for, that you can make really impactful. Join that company and just kick ass for 3 years, because I guarantee you that investor is going to notice. And like, who do you think are like the first people that like, if you said like, hey, we're expanding our team's headcount by 1, I'm not going to some like random person that like, the reason it's somewhat opaque is like, why would I take the risk on the random person that maybe has limited startup experience is trying to like hustle their way into VC? Or do I go like recruit one of the portfolio executives of a company that I've like watched execute like crazy? I know that person is invested on the side, has been absolutely crushing it. All the employees of that company like really admire that person. The founder admires that person. I'm like, great. I know that you have the nose. I know that you know how to build the company. I know all these things. It's much less risky. And like in venture, I think some of the time people don't appreciate like how much more we have to trust our colleagues than in a traditional job. Like in a traditional job, you're a customer support agent at Square. You see your entire customer support team every day. You see your manager every single day. You work for 12 hours a day in the same room, right next to each other, desks right next to each other. look around my room right now. There's nobody at Founders Fund within 40 feet of me, right? And so they need to trust for the 12 hours that I am like representing Founders Fund today to founders, to LPs, to potential audience members from this podcast, that I am appropriately representing the Founders Fund brand. I'm making the right decisions. I'm helping the founders the right way with very, very limited oversight, right? And so that's why it's such a deep trust game. Is it's unlike other operating positions where you're constantly interacting with one another. Venture by default is sort of like a team sport, but then everybody only reconvenes every week basically to like just be like, how did your week go? Great, talk to you in a week basically, which obviously would be very abnormal for an operating role.
Love it. Thank you for dissecting that. I think it was super clear for a lot of people who might be interested in that world. Look, Delian, there is so much more that we can cover today, but before we go, I want to make sure we throw you into the hot seat. So I got to ask, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Let's do this, man. Look, I know we just talked so much about kind of the VC world, but if we had to give you an entry-level job at any company today, which company would you pick if you could go anywhere?
I mean, I'm obviously biased, but I would take Varda. If I had to remove like Varda from the equation and it's like entry level, I don't know. I'd probably go work at one of like, the crazy Elon companies like Boring Company or Neuralink or something like that, just for sake of like getting to be a part of a crazy project.
Love it. Okay. If you and I were to hop on a plane right now, jet off to New York City, I give you an unlimited marketing budget to smear anything you want across Times Square, what would you put up there?
Probably something along the lines of just like, I don't know, fuck communism and fuck socialism. And like, I don't know. I don't think, but probably something like both slightly distasteful and controversial, but that like is a core value of mine.
I love it. And last question, given that you're in Miami right now, I know a lot of people have moved there over the last, call it 6 to 12 months. What's your forecast for the next 5-10 years for that city?
Yeah, I mean, this might sound like, crazy optimistic, but I actually think that Miami has the opportunity to become the largest tech ecosystem within the United States, partially because it represents an international metropolis that looks like a lot of the other extremely large tech ecosystems, right? If you look at, Singapore or Hong Kong or Shanghai, both the like culture, the climate, they all look much more similar to Miami than they do to any other city, right? Like if you look at Dubai, much more similar to Miami than any other American city. And it's largely extremely international, right? It's like, yes, it's American in its values, but like, infinite number of languages that are being spoken on the street. The second is extreme propensity and willingness to grow, right? If you look at San Francisco, I think part of what really prevented it from, succeeding and becoming the metropolis or the utopia that it could have been was the complete unwillingness of the local government to actually continue to build, right? San Francisco looks the exact same basically that it did a decade ago. Sure, Hayes Valley has a couple of 3-story buildings that got built up, but there's not much. The Victorian homes are still mostly the Victorian homes along most blocks in San Francisco. Versus if I walk like around 3 blocks of Miami, there are more cranes than like all of San Francisco combined. Like Brickell, where I'm sitting right now, this tower and like this entire ecosystem didn't exist 10, 11 years ago. This was literally like all like 2-story buildings. And now this is effectively like as large as all of Soma in San Francisco and literally got built over the course of the next decade. The following decade, there's going to be just as much growth. And so because of that, I think it's going to be much more able to absorb the growth of the startups that are here. I think there's some really great ingredients that are here, both top tier VCs, founders, people that are born and raised here, people that are importing engineers and founders and product, here. But as those companies grow, like hell, Keith's Open Store, I'm sure right now it's 20, 25 employees. I guarantee you within 5, 6, 7 years, it's going to be north of 1,000 employees. Typically in the Bay Area, they would have immediately had to start to splinter things and, put some people in Toronto, some people, in Salt Lake City or something like that, versus because it's being born and raised in Miami, the entire company can stay here because you can actually grow into the city while keeping housing costs low because people here are actually willing to build. Right? Like you can, have something that looks like, Facebook's Menlo Park campus and have most of the company there without, driving housing costs through the roof. If you look at actually got just released today, the MLS just released their like, house appreciation numbers. Florida's house appreciation is literally just the average of the United States. like, it is just, it's the equivalent of the supply and demand across the entire country, which means that we're actually making sure that, like, despite the fact that there's this massive influx, you're hearing about all these people that are moving here, the house appreciation, and for sure, if you take the Venetian Islands, like Keith's neighborhood, yes, that is appreciated like crazy. If you take the average home in Miami, it's only appreciated 12% over the past year, which is like the equivalent of the average in the United States. And so people here are willing to build to absorb that growth. And that's why I think it's potentially going to become the largest ecosystem, because exponential curves, man, they move really fast.
Love it. You survived the hot seat. Look, Delian, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Really want to make sure that people can connect with you. Where do you hang out on the internet outside of Twitter itself?
Oh man. Yeah, I mean, definitely like 90% of my like online time is Twitter. I guess other than that, it's if you want to chat with me, it's Delian at foundersfund.com is the only other place I guess I really hang out. That's my other, whatever, 90% of my time.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. And as we always say at Career Meets World, go unleash your wildest potential. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Cheers, Edward.